Welcome to another episode of Just a Minute on Screen Printers Radio, where we bring you tips for improving the screen printing process. I'm Bill Hood, and I can be reached at billhoodconsulting.com online. Today I want to speak to you about using a step test for determining exposure times. A step test for correct exposure is never going to work in the way that you think it will. The test is done with one screen, with its own mesh count, thread diameter, unique tension level, emulsion thickness, and more. The next stencil will never match the stencil you did the test on. And of course, the exposure will be different on every stencil. The only surefire way to guarantee exposure is to eliminate the variables. Fine-tuning the mesh, tension, coating technique, and knowing the correct exposure for every stencil before you load the screen into the exposure unit is a simple three-part process. Step 1. Once you have a list of every mesh count and thread diameter combination that you use in your shop, and you retension the mesh to maintain the same tension level, then you know the amount of emulsion that will fill the mesh openings on a particular mesh count. And bam, you've eliminated those variables. Step 2. Next, you need to do a base coat and let it dry. Measure the dry stencil with a calibrated thickness gauge and determine how many face coats it needs to meet the emulsion over mesh ratio. Build the thickness to the same exact thickness for that mesh count every time, and bam, another variable eliminated. Step 3. To borrow a phrase from my friend Richard Greaves, it's a lot like cooking pancakes. The thicker the emulsion, the more time it'll take to properly cross-harden the emulsion. Using the base exposure time from a previous stencil that you measured, if the new stencil is 90% of the thickness, then you simply reduce the exposure by 10%. By measuring the thickness of the final stencil, you automatically know the correct exposure. And then, bam, perfect exposures every time. Fine-tuning the process guarantees your success as a screen maker. Excellence comes from doing the right things every time. This concludes today's Just a Minute podcast. Thanks for listening. Visit Screen Printers Radio at screenprintersradio.com online. Thank you. I'm Bill Hood.